Bonjour tout le monde. Nous avons fait une nation de Julia Child. I'm so excited to be talking about Julia Child with you today. Recently, I've just watched another documentary or show on her. She is such an inspiring American who really impacted so many different cultural aspects of American society by learning French. So we are going to talk about that today. So if you're not familiar with Julia Child, I am delighted to help you learn about her. This is a saying from her: people who love to eat are always the best people. And so in American culture, Julia was one of the first food icons, and she was also one of the first, she was the very first to have her own cooking show, especially a female, which was unheard of. So we're just going to learn a little bit about her history, how she ended up so knowledgeable about French culture and French cuisine. And hopefully you'll walk away being inspired and wanting to learn some French cooking and French culture. So born Julia McWilliams, Child was the oldest of three children. Her parents, John McWilliams Jr. and Julia Caroline Weston, provided a privileged upbringing for their children. McWilliams, the father, was a Princeton alumna and an early investor in California real estate, while Julia's mother was the heiress to a paper company and the daughter of a Massachusetts politician. When she attended the elite Catherine Branson School for Girls in San Francisco, she was already 6'2" tall. So she was a tall woman. She had a presence. She also obviously was the tallest girl in her class. She loved to play all sorts of different sports, especially basketball and volleyball. But she obviously had a presence when she walked into a room. Julia eventually enrolled at Smith College in Northampton. So she went from West Coast to East Coast, and she had aspirations of becoming a famous author. So you actually have to remember, at this period of time, this was the late 1920s and early 1930s. So Julia, being a female during this period of time, really had one main goal, and it wasn't necessarily to get a degree. The reason women went to college back in those days, the emphasis was to find a husband. That saying, spring by ring or ring by spring, your goal was to find someone that would be able to be your caretaker. And so your education was actually like second compared to finding a husband. And during that period of time at Smith College, Julia didn't find a husband. And so as she graduated, she felt very adventurous. She always, even though she came from a very conservative upbringing, she was curious by nature. And she even attempted to join the military after college, but was turned away for being too tall at 6'2". If you can imagine that, I feel like she would have been good at something in the military for that height, but being that tall and a woman, they rejected her. And so she, really kind of lost her way a little bit. She wasn't sure what she wanted to do. So after college, knowing that she did want to become an author, she did move to New York City. And New York City had so much for her. They had food, it had culture, it had excitement, and she was able to continue to pursue being an author. She even submitted multiple manuscripts to the New Yorker and wrote short plays in her spare time. However, none of her early work was published. One of the reasons I really enjoy learning about Julia Child is that her success came later in life, and she broke these boundaries for women that were unheard of at the time, and she was relentless, and she was okay with being different. She was okay to not meet the expectations of society and do things a little bit differently. So eventually, she did end up working for the Office of Strategic Services. She began volunteering as a research assistant. This was a newly formed government intelligence agency that would eventually become the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. And according in her interview notes, the following was written about her: she had a good impression, she was pleasant, she was alert, she was capable, and very tall, which all of these things you could tell were true by just looking at her. So her dream came true. So when she started working for the OSS, she was offered her first opportunity to go abroad. And so she went over to China. And this was such an exciting time for her because she'd never left the country. This allowed her to learn more about food. It learned more about culture, and all of those things as well. And during her time at the OSS, Julia Child developed a shark repellent and facilitated the communication of important top secret documents between U.S. government officials and their intelligence officer. And so she played a really important role and knew a lot of information about really important things that were happening during World War II. And while living and working on wartime assignments in China, she fell in love with the local cuisine. You know, this was the first time when she was raised at home in California. It was meat and potatoes. There was nothing really exciting about it. And so this was really the first time that she expanded her palate and realized how phenomenal food could be. And this is something that she said, American food in China was terrible. The Chinese food was wonderful, and we ate out as often as we could. This is when I became interested in food, and I just love Chinese food. So it's really interesting as well that she fell in love with Chinese food first. So Julia Child's story goes to show that it's never too late to discover your passion in life, because by this time, she was in her early 30s. And honestly, in the 1930s, if you're in your early 30s and you hadn't been married yet, like, you've been basically written off, right? You are a spinster. But what's also amazing, when she fell in love with Chinese food, she also fell in love with an officer named Paul Child, who was also serving in China at the time. And he happened to be about 10 years older than Julia, and he enjoyed taking her out and introducing her to all these new amazing cuisines. And after meeting through the OSS, and this is them here. You can see Julia and Paul, and she is taller than him. It would probably be really hard for a woman that's 6'2", to find many a match that would be agreeable or at her same height. So, you know, that didn't bother Paul at all. So after meeting through the OSS at the age of 34, which was considered unusually late in life in the 1940s, they married. So this is such a great story too. Not only did her passions and her fruitions about her own business success come later in life, and so did her love. And so it just goes to show how life can take us on so many different paths and introduce to us what we want, maybe at a different time and maybe not the time that we expected to. And so this is really when Julia starts to blossom, is after she marries Paul. So what happens after she marries Paul, and I think this is also, I want to preface this really quickly too, is that Paul, he was a huge influence for her work and why she started doing French cuisine, but they were an absolute team. He supported her in every facet and every aspect of their life. And so one of the reasons she was so successful is because she had a strong man supporting her. And I think that's really important to point out, especially during these times of the 1940s. So Paul and Julia never had children, but they had a very intense, amazing love affair with each other. And so something that they were famous for, and these are actually postcards that they made, they were infamous for their Valentine's postcards they would send out. Julia remarked that her and Paul could never get their Christmas cards out on time, and so they always enjoyed doing a Valentine's Day. They didn't have children, so it was a way they could celebrate their love and share it with their loved ones depending where they were traveling. And so the picture where you see them in the bathtub was actually taken in Germany. So this was one of their Valentine's Days. So it's so fun to see their goofiness and silliness. And this went on later, way into, they were married for years and years and years and had a really fulfilling, happy marriage, which is also so inspiring to see this two support each other in both of their jobs and be successful at the same time. And that Paul was pushing her to break these boundaries at a time where women were mostly confined to the kitchen and raising children. This quote here says, "The secret of a happy marriage is finding the right person. You know they're right if you love to be with them all the time." And Julia and Paul spent a ton of time together. And so this is them in Paris. And this is really how it all started for Julia. After moving to Paris, the reason they ended up there was that Paul worked for the government as a cultural ambassador almost. And so he was there in Paris to promote all things American and all things great about America. And Julia felt pretty lonely when he was working all day. She wanted to learn something. She was going to the market every day to find food and realized she didn't really know how to prepare it, especially because she also grew up having food prepared for her. So this is another reason why this is so inspiring, is that Julia Julia did not start cooking until later in life. And to see what she then did with it is really amazing. And so after moving to Paris, Child began taking cooking lessons at one of the most prestigious culinary schools in the world, Le Cordon Bleu. In Paris. And actually, Le Cordon Bleu, which is fascinating, was started by a woman. But Julia was one of the very first. It wasn't very common that women would take classes here. It is male-dominated profession, especially in Paris, if you're talking about being a chef. And so if you can see here on the right-hand side, she is standing with all these, her teacher and her fellow classmates, who also, if you could imagine her walking in as the only female, and she was just as tall or taller than her classmates, and she'd never cooked before. And all of these men have been training for years to be chefs, and so obviously they looked down upon her. Also, the woman that ran the school had no faith in her whatsoever, and actually, didn't really care if she succeeded or not, and kind of put up obstacles for her. So this is where you really start to see how disciplined Julia was and how determined she was. If you get a chance to watch the movie Julie and Julia, there's an amazing scene where she's basically is being teased at the school because she can't cut onions. And she goes home and she cuts onions and cuts onions and cuts onions. And she returns to class and she ends up cutting onions faster and better than anybody in the class. And I think it goes to show why she became so successful, that she was not intimidated by these men. She was not intimidated by the fact that there wasn't other women. She was willing to push through to show that she was capable of keeping up and learning to do just what they were doing as well. So I love that aspect of it. So she trained for 6 months in the art of French cooking, during which time she took private lessons from the chef Max Bourgnon. After she graduated, she started her own cooking school along with 2 other students, Simone Beck and Louisette Berthold, called L'École des Trois Gourmands, the School of Three Gourmands. And so these were 2 French women that she happened to meet as she was doing different social events in Paris. And they convinced her, and they kind of decided together that it would be a good idea to do a cookbook. So originally they started doing lessons for maybe American wives that were in Paris to learn how to do French cooking. Julia had a great grasp of the English language, and then she was able to work with these French women to make the best recipes to work for American women. So what they decided to do was begin to write a cookbook that would change her life forever and bring French cuisine into American households. And Julia was just thinking, like, if I can do this, how can I make this simple enough for American women, and now American men and women or people, to cook in their households? And so this was a huge shift, because this was the 1950s now, where many women were just using canned goods. That was the quick, simple, easy thing to do. So this was really introducing a different style. And so here's the book, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, by Simone Beck, Louisette Berthold, and Julia Child. Really amazing that she was able to get it published. It was rejected a couple of times just because of it was huge, and she really had to start paring it down. And also, obviously, people it was hard to convince American editors, mostly men, that American women would want to use this in their kitchen and that they would be able to do it. So after multiple rewrites, the book was eventually published in 1961. And this was after rewrites, years of testing and retesting recipes, and setbacks. Because what they discovered was that because of the metric system and how we use our measurements using cups compared to grams and all of those kind of things, that Julia had to figure out what the best way was to translate that into our recipes so that we could understand. And so it took so much effort. And what's amazing about this, even though people were really resistant to this, the book quickly became a bestseller, but she still had to do a ton of work before this happened. What's really funny is, so she was invited on to promote her new book. Child appeared on a live TV program. So it was public television in Boston, and demonstrated how to cook an omelet. And first of all, they never had promoted a cookbook. They were really, the people that decided to even try this did not know that she was going to bring a hot plate to this public television airing of live TV. So she put on a hot plate in front of this man that was conducting this interview, who was just flabbergasted at the fact that she would do this, because no one had ever, cooked live on TV, let alone with a hot plate. She brought all of her materials to cook an omelet. She cooked an omelet on this hot plate, basically on her hands and knees, because it was just like a night table, basically, that she had everything set up on. And she did it so well that the audience immediately fell in love with her, because she was humble, she was funny, she made it look easy, she didn't make it look complicated. And then she served this omelet to the host of the show, who seemed quite perturbed with her because she was doing things that were just unheard of at the time. And of course, it was like the most delicious omelet he had ever tasted. And then the TV station that hosted the show got more letters about her episode that she was on than any other guest that ever appeared on television. So viewers quickly fell in love with her cheery, personable chef like personality, her unique voice, and Child was soon offered her very own show. But she really had to push for it, because obviously with her height, her looks, her age, this is again so unheard of. So Julia at this point in time had entered her 50s. It was unheard of for a woman to be on television at this point in her life with no experience and have her own cooking show. Women's place at the time was in the kitchen, cooking for their family, doing the clothes. And so the fact that she was even on TV at this age, that she wasn't casted aside, also because she wasn't necessarily your traditional beauty, she really had to push and advocate for herself, because she knew how special she was, to continue to push forward and allow it to have her own show. A lot of the editors at the first TV program were like, her looks, she's too tall, she's too weird, her voice is awful, everything stereotypical that people say about women. And she went in there and was like, don't you think I've heard these things every single day? Give me a chance. I will pay for everything the next episode. If we get a good feedback again, we'll just make a decision from there. So they agreed to it. And as I mentioned, viewers quickly fell in love with her, and eventually she got her own show. And this is what I also love about this. This program ran for 10 years, after which Child continued to star in multiple other TV shows and published more cookbooks as well. And so she was one of the first ever to have a successful TV show. She was the first woman to definitely have a successful cooking TV show. And she was the first one, if you think about how popular food shows are today, she was the first one to cook live, and she did French cooking. She had to make French cooking look easy, which it's a very difficult feat to do. So one of the very first episodes of The French Chef featured Child cooking beef bourguignon. The dish, which takes more than 6 hours to prepare, would eventually become practically synonymous with Child. So that's something that she is really familiar with cooking. And Child starred in 8 television cooking series and published 11 cookbooks. For 40 years, she was considered America's leading chef and one of the first ever celebrity chefs. And so on a larger picture, she introduced French cuisine to the everyday American and brought it into our kitchens and really revolutionized how we thought about cooking fresh, cooking with the ingredients that we have, and getting away from the canned processed kind of food. And so that in itself is amazing. So here she is, just winning on a couple of different TV shows that she has. And she was awarded France's highest honor, the Legion of Honor, for this introducing French cuisine to America. And so the French honored her as well. And of course, Julia was forever humble. The measure of achievement is not winning awards. It's doing something that you appreciate, something you believe is worthwhile. And so if you ever get a chance to watch something about Julia, that's what you can see, is that she's really, really passionate and she appreciates what she's doing. She just really loved what she was doing. So it became easy for her to explain it to other people how amazing French cuisine was and how you can be capable of doing that. And I think that's one of the messages I love most about Julia, is that she was very passionate and she loved doing what she did. And when you love doing what you do, other things come much easier. They come naturally. And so she was able to become, the chef on TV at 50 years old as a woman, which was unheard of. She won one of the highest awards from France. And so I'm truly inspired by Julia, just always pushing and breaking these boundaries. And she really worked up into her 80s. She never stopped. One of the things I really loved about Julia as well, because I'm also a cat person. She always had cats, whether she lived in Paris, whether she lived in Norway, whether she was living in Boston. And no matter what, she always named her cat Minette. It always had the same name, no matter where she went. And so I always find that to be really, really cute, of course. And then just 2 days before her 92nd birthday, she died of kidney failure, but she kept a relatively active lifestyle up until a month before her death, frequenting farmers markets and eating at restaurants multiple times per week. In this line of work, you keep right on till you're through. Retired people are boring, she once said. So just to wrap this up, Julia was the grand dame of cooking. She brought more people to the kitchen that had never thought of going into the kitchen. She's never been matched on television. She was humorous. She could just arrest your attention. Whatever the magic is, she had it, and it is so rare. And this is something that was said by cookbook author Marion Cunningham. And that is so true about her. Whatever that magic is, she had it, and she had that joie de vivre. And what inspired her was Paris, French culture, French food, eating, knowing where your food comes from. And then she felt so inspired to try to teach that to Americans, which is a really big feat. And then, finding her place in our society as well. She also had a cottage in France. And from I've read a lot of books of hers. I've, seen quite a few things. She was mindful about always moving forward. So when her daughter went back with her to close up the cottage, knowing that she was in her mid-80s and it would be too much to travel back again, she didn't ever have regret. She didn't lament things. She just knew that was the next phase. And so I always found that really inspiring about her too. Life's too short for fake butter or fake people. So that's always something to keep in mind that Julia Child said. If you want to learn more about Julia and you haven't seen this movie, I love the movie Julie and Julia. It is a woman that tries to cook all of her recipes, and it gives you a great idea of her story and how she got inspired in the early years in Paris. Right now on HBO, there is a short series called Julia, and it's actually when she came back to the United States and started to break into this food cooking, and it's phenomenal to see these two different phases in her life. So if you want to check out more, these are two great recommendations I have for you. Okay, so I guess I'll leave with bon appetit.